If you've not made the semi-finals of your fantasy league, do not worry. Fantasy Gameday is here to make DFS streets in the UK great again. We're going to break down this week's Sunday Stars slate, talking you through the best matchups, the best captains, and of course, those all-important value picks. We're going to start at the top, Tom, with the captain picks. Looking at this week's slate, is it a case of there is an absolutely smack you in the face obvious pick, or do you think it could be a little bit more spreading your bets and looking at a few different players?
I think there's some really solid bets towards the top. Try to decide which one of those is going to be the right one is always a tricky part, of course. But I think it's more of a running back week than a wide receiver week. I think that there's some really nice wide receiver matchups, but I don't feel like their ceiling outcomes are as in play as much as I do with running backs.
Yeah, potentially. And a few of those, Mike Evans, CeeDee Lamb being on the baller slates or the Saturday slates does change things ever so slightly. We're going to start at the top, though. Jamar Gibbs, no David Montgomery. We know this Lions team absolutely needs a win. Jamar Gibbs feels like an absolute smash this week. A little bit cheaper than some options at £7,800. Does this one just make too much sense to look anywhere else?
Yeah, it does. Because, I mean, like all year, we've talked about the fact that you can run on the Chicago Bears. They've been a run funnel all year. And now their defense is just cratering ever since they fired Maya Baflus. They were first in EPA allowed to drop back weeks 1 to 8. And since they're 27th, their defense, they've been poor against the run all year. In DVOA, they've ranked like in the bottom 3 throughout the entire season. They are now 31st. They've allowed the 5th most fantasy points to the running back position all year. Jahmyr Gibbs averages 6 more PPR points per game in games that David Montgomery's missed. Those 3 games, he went 18 for 82, 20 for 126 and 1, 31 for 189 and 1. And it just makes sense for the Bears would be a team we want to attack. The Lions, with all their injury issues, they would probably like to try and control the game where they can. This is one of the second game that Jared Goff's played outside all year. The last time he played outside was in Green Bay, and he played very well. It was a much better game than we've typically seen out from him outside. But this one, if it's cold weather, if it's windy, then it just all stacks up to be a Jahmyr Gibbs week.
Absolutely. I think whatever way you paint this matchup, whatever you paint this game, it equals Jahmyr Gibbs points. And yeah, that's exactly what you want from your captain pick. One of my favourite values on this entire slate, though, Devon Achane, valued down at £6,600. A potentially challenging matchup with the 49ers, depending on what defense shows up. But such bankable volume every single week. He's been over 14 fantasy points in the last 5 weeks on the trot. But more importantly, he has seen 7 targets in 3 consecutive weeks. It feels like to getting nervous. This offensive line is an absolute turnstile. So he's just checking down to Achane as often as he can. Do you think that there's the ceiling outcome as much as he's a potentially good value with Achane this week?
Yeah, I do think that the ceiling. And last week was the first time in in 6 games that Chan hadn't found the end zone, and it resulted in his worst fantasy finish in that period, where he finished as RB14. Obviously, we'd prefer him to score over 20 points. The last thing you want to do is create a really good lineup and then have a poor captain selection. But you can run on the Niners. When you talk about the Niners, they are a top 12 unit across the board in DVOA at every position, apart from against the run, where they rank 19th. They've given up the 12th most fantasy points to the running back position. Everything that the Miami do flows through Devon Achane at the minute, and I would feel very confident about starting him as captain pretty much every week.
Yeah, it's nice confidence to have in him. And then when you said you save a little bit more money, it's a reduced price. It's a really encouraging start. You said it's ideally a running back week. Looking at the wide receiver position, though, we do have Puka Nacua. He's been incredibly reliable since returning from injury, over 17 points every single game since week 10. Do you think there's a world where you could build a lineup with Nacua in that captain slot?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the Jets, they're just, they're a poor defense. They rank 27th in EPA per drop back allowed since week 9. They rank 27th against the pass in DVOA across the whole season. Against wide receiver 1 specifically, they rank 27th. They've struggled all year. Puka Nakua's had at least 30% target share in each of his last 6 games. The Jets also allow the second most screen yardage per game since week 11. We know Puka Nakua is going to get involved in that as well as downfield. Sauce Gardner's had a pretty poor year, and I wouldn't expect him to be able to stop Nakua. There's just no reason why I wouldn't want to play Puka Nakua.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very encouraging option, and you can get some really interesting potential stacks as well. Talking of stacks, it's time for stack of the week. Tom, it's Trey McBride week. We know that he is finding the end zone. I'm almost guaranteeing it. How do you feel about a Kyler and McBride stack?
Yeah, and the biggest part of this, which would give me pause, would be whether I wanted to play Kyler, not Trey McBride. Like, Trey McBride has 116 targets with 0 touchdowns, which if he had even 2 or 3 receiving touchdowns, he does have the rushing touchdown, he does have a fumble recovery touchdown. If he had even 2 or 3 touchdowns, then the stigma attached to it wouldn't be anywhere near it. But Trey McBride is absolutely going to be the tight end 2 in fantasy next year behind Brock Bowers and ADP. And this matchup against the Panthers couldn't have been any more friendly because the Panthers have allowed 10 different tight ends to score touchdowns against them. Kyler, constantly a problem for me when it comes to deciding whether he's going to have a good week or a bad week. His rushing production's been very up and down, been below 25 yards in 3 of the last 4 games, I think, off the top of my head. But because of that, people probably aren't desperate to play him. And at 6,200, that makes it a good leverage play.
Yeah, definitely like the way you think about that one. Now, this next stack is a little bit disgusting. It is incredibly thin, but you know me, I'm a value hunter. I'm looking for as many cheap options as I can. I sent this to Tom, and his response is probably not safe for work. Mason Rudolph and the Titans, 4,200 for Mason Rudolph, 2,400 for Chico Conquo, and the bottom bargain price of 2,200 for Tyler Boyd. Could you see a world where Mason Rudolph, high volume of pass attempts, lots of checkdowns, and maybe gives a Conquo and Boyd a decent floor?
Yeah, and I'm definitely on board with Mason Rudolph at 4,200. I'll just put that out there nice and early because Rudolph's finished as a top 20 quarterback in 4 games this year, including last week when he came into the game. In the second half, he didn't start the game. He finishes to QB 13. So Mason Rudolph is absolutely better at putting up fantasy points more consistently than Will Levis, who I know we've talked about on here. I felt hopeful that Will Levis could be somebody that would be really useful down the stretch, and he just hasn't been. But I still think that it's worth considering Mason Rudolph here because the Colts defense, they're very poor. The Titans, they really seem to be still trying. At least that's what we can say about them. Chuka Okonkwo has been more involved over the last few weeks than he was previously. I don't know whether that's because he was finally getting on the same page with Will Levis, and maybe that regresses now. Tyler Boyd is fine, but I think I'd skinny stat this. I'd take Mason Rudolph and I'd play one of Boyd or Okonkwo. I struggle to see everyone paying off to their ceiling outcomes enough where I can get on board with it.
Just think of how many stars you could slot in around these 3 as a potential lineup. That would have so much money to play with, Tom.
Yeah, but it's like you really need those stars to hit their nuclear outcomes because otherwise you're tying up 3 out of 7 or 8 players within your lineup absolutely have to have good games and they're all coming from the same environment. So it's interesting. I'll play around with some projections with these stacks this weekend and see where I come down on it.
I look forward to seeing the results. The complete opposite of a bargain basement Titan stack, though. Can I interest you in spending all of your budget on 3 players? We've got the Bengal stack, Joe Burrow 7,200, Chase at 8,200, and then Chase Brown at £7,400. You might have to find a lot of value at other slots, but this feels like it could be a lot of points here.
Yeah, and I think you have to immediately slot either Jamar Chase or Chase Brown into your captain slot if you're going with this stack, because you're going to need to use your flex positions to probably play double tight end and take 2 punt tight ends. You're probably going to need to punt one of the running back positions down to some of the value plays that we'll talk about later. But the Bengals, their first in pass rate over expected over the last 4 weeks. They've just absolutely had the throttle down. Chase Brown's been a top 4 running back in 4 of the last 6 games, finished no worse than RB9 in that period, been the RB2 since week 9 onwards. Joe Burrow is now tied with Tom Brady for the only quarterback to go 260 plus yards and 3 touchdowns in 6 games straight. Of course, Tom Brady actually won games, so it's a slight difference there. But yeah, I think you can do whatever you want against the Browns. Their defense has been poor all year, and I can definitely see this one. And the Bengals, they're still slightly alive in the playoff race, so they want to win this game. I don't mind it. It's going to be uncomfortable putting this much salary in one team, but if people aren't ready to do it, then we should be ready to do it.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about high-priced captains, stacks of the weeks, we will come on to those super cheap value plays. But some of our favorite plays from those mid-priced options. I'm going to start with Zach Charbonnet. I'm projecting this as no Kenneth Walker this week, which it feels like it's trending towards that way. Yes, Charbonnet didn't get home last week with fancy points, but he still got the volume. It was just that the game script meant that he didn't get a huge amount of touches. Are you willing to go back to the well this week and risk it all again for Zach Charbonnet?
Yeah, depending on how things shake out over the weekend, of course. Because I think that if you've got a banged up Geno Smith, then you need to start looking, can this be a game where you've got more running back production? Now, the Vikings have been excellent against the running back position all year. They've allowed the third fewest points to the position. They are a top 3 run defense in DVOA. But Zach Charbonnet gets there through both checkdowns and through the run game, whereas Kenneth Walker isn't really as involved through the passing game. So I don't mind Zach Charbonnet. I think at this price, he has plenty of paths to paying off. I'm not quite as high on him as you, but I think if you want to pay one of the more expensive stacks, then you are going to have to look at this range.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another value position, you talked on our main preview over on the other channel about how you feel it could be an Alexander Mattison week over an Amir Abdullah week. You got to pay up a little bit at 3,200. It feels like it's a floor play rather than perhaps a ceiling play. Do you see a world where you could get on board with Alexander Mattison?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like last week, we saw Amir Abdullah have 10 touches to Alexander Mattison's 9 after Sincere McCormick left the game, which might keep the ownership on Mattison down a little bit, which is what I'm kind of thinking about with this one. But I think that if the game script between the Jags and the Raiders is more neutral than last week, where the Raiders were chasing the game against the Falcons throughout, then perhaps we see Mattison take control of the game a little bit more. I don't feel incredible about it, but I'm open to it. And again, if you're looking at an expensive stack, these are the kind of punts you're going to have to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And then our final favorite player of the week, Malik Neighbors on an absolute tear. This Giants offense hasn't got many options to look elsewhere. Do you see a world where he could see enough volume yet again to potentially pay off that £6,000 price?
Yeah, definitely. And the Falcons, they're a reasonable pass defense, but they're nothing special. It's more just what they do with Jesse Bates. Where do they move him to? Because if Jesse Bates ends up helping out in double coverage, then it could be a tough game. But they rank 21st against wide receiver ones in DVOA. They rank 26th against the pass in general, which is something which we shouldn't shy away from. They've given up the 4th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Malik Neighbors hit 40% target share for the 4th time last week, according to JJ Zacharyson. No other wide receivers gone over that mark twice this year. And it just feels like Malik Neighbors is doing everything he can to survive with terrible quarterback play. I'm expecting the Falcons to be slightly spicy this week with Michael Penix, and I feel like Malik Neighbors can be a good stacking partner to those stacks.
Yeah, I certainly like that as an option. We're going to move across to my favorite section of the week, the key enablers, those bargain basement options that can absolutely swing a week and enable you to climb that leaderboard while spending very few pennies at the right time. Malik Washington's our first guy. This is potentially Jalen Waddle out. We saw last week when Jalen Waddle did go out, Malik Washington became almost an every snap player. Do you think if he does play the majority of snaps, there's a world where this offense that has been sputtering in the passing game could see enough targets for Tyreek Hill, Johnny Smith, Devon Achane, and still have enough left over for Malik Washington to hit?
Yeah, and maybe it comes at the expense of one of those guys, but I definitely think at 2,200 that I'd be willing to pay it. Last week he caught 5 of his 6 targets for 52 yards. If I can get that again, we're talking 10.2 points in PPR formats. At 2,200, that is absolutely going to pay off. The Niners, their defense is in kind of shambles. We know that they're done and dusted for the season. They have allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Their defense is a top 5 unit, but I just think once you get to this point, things just kind of change for these teams who are out of the playoffs. Like, there's very little to play for. And San Francisco are going cross country to play at Miami. So I'm completely fine with that. The Niners play the sixth most zone coverage. Tua ranks third in QBR against zone coverage. And Malik Washington feels like the kind of player who could be a good zone coverage beater.
Absolutely, and explosive. If he's the kind of player that can take one touch to the house from anywhere on the field. So, yeah, hopefully there's enough volume, but you might be able to get home on 1 or 2 touches, quite frankly. Another cheap option at the running back position this week, Amir Abdullah. It feels like I talk about him every single week, Tom. It feels like it's a low ceiling option, but you say you want 8 points. Do you think you get 8 points from Amir Abdullah against a pretty poor Jacksonville Jaguars defense?
I do, because dating back to week 11, he's had 3 touchdowns. He's had scores of 10.7, 17.5, 7.3, 0.8, and 19.6. Last week, 10 for 66 and 1. He's a player who's going to be used in the passing game. He's had games over the last few weeks where he's had 6 targets. Last week, Desmond Ridder, the check down machine, did target him 7 times. I'm not expecting him to necessarily see that many, but he's used in both areas of the game. So, yeah, I'm completely fine with Amir Abdullah, particularly if you don't like the Alexander Mattison shout 3,200 as opposed to his 2,200.
Absolutely. Well, it's a very interesting slate this week on Fantasy Gameday. We've got the Saturday game. We've obviously got the Sunday Stars, and there's the baller options as well. If you haven't tried it out, you can use the code TFS23 for a free second entry when you deposit and get that first lineup submitted. Best of luck this week. I hope you bring home some cash. And if you do, let us know. And of course, hit the subscribe button and get those lineups entered now.